Hey guys, happy Wednesday night, and tonight we're going to be talking about running, specifically training for 5Ks, 10Ks, ultras, half marathons, and marathons, and where people often go wrong when they're training. So usually when people are training, they're training for a race, right? So there's this training plan. You're planning out how much you're going to run. There's a structure to it. You're starting with less running, you're progressing to more running. And within that progression is usually where things go wrong. So usually people progress too quickly. That's one of the number one reasons why overuse injuries happen. The muscles, the bones, they're just not all fully adapted yet, and they can't sustain the load, the cumulative load, not the individual load of each running step, but the cumulative load of all of the running put together combined. It's just too much. They can't handle it. They haven't adapted yet. They haven't been given the time that they need to adapt. So therefore you get injured. So in order to help prevent the injuries, there's this thing called a rule of 10%. And it means don't increase the distance or the time more than 10% what you did the week before. And so this depends, whichever one you want to use, depends on how you kind of calculate your running. If you calculate your running by, I went for a 50-minute run, then you wouldn't want to increase it more than 10% of that, so 55 minutes. If you calculate it by miles, so you went for a 10 miles total in a week, you wouldn't want to go up to more than 11 miles the next week. However, this can get kind of sticky with when people are just starting. Like, say you've never run before. Where do you start? Because if you follow this 10% rule and you're starting at a really low number, it's going to take you forever to get where you want to go. So initially or along the way, you may be doing some bigger jumps than you necessarily should do in order to get where you want to go. And that's really hard, and there isn't a clear-cut answer for when can I progress faster, and when should I maybe not, and where should I start. It does depend on your running history, though, and your physical fitness level. So if you're previously a fairly active runner, maybe you run once or twice a week, and you want to start training for a longer race. Well, then starting at like 3 times a week, 15 miles total, that's a reasonable place to start. If you've never run before and you want to just start running, then I would start with a walking or a jogging program, kind of alternating that, or a walking and a running program and alternating it. If you are very, very active, you have a really good cardiovascular base, and you never really ran and you want to start running, that's the population that tends to get injured the most when they start running, simply because their body just isn't used to the running, but yet they are in good enough physical shape to actually do all the running. So that's something, if you fall into that category and you're like, I want to start running now because I'm stuck at home and there's nothing else I can do, that would be, if you're in that population, just kind of watch for an overuse injury and catch it before it becomes an issue. If you like to nerd out on the exercise type stuff, like exactly how much can I do, because the rule of 10% is a rule of thumb, there's something called the acute to chronic workload ratio. And that basically means you take the acute volume of 1 week and you compare it to the chronic volume of the past 4 weeks. And you want that acute volume of the next week to be within 80 to 130% of the average of the chronic volume from the previous 4 weeks. Now, that's a lot of talking and words, and I find it makes more sense if you break it down, which is why I have this board behind me. So this is an example. I did the numbers to make the math easy. So for week 1 to week 4, every single week, say you ran 25 miles. So that puts your cumulative, your chronic total at 100 miles. Divide that by 4, and you're going to get your average weekly volume, which is 25 miles. So then you would take 80% of that, which is 20, up to 130%, which is 32.5 down over here. And that is the volume or that range you would want to stay in for week 5. And then you'd kind of keep going and going forward based on that. So that's kind of breaking down the acute to chronic workload ratio. This is what has the most research behind it. They've done a lot of research with higher level athletes, people who are fairly active, and they found that this is kind of that sweet spot where you can increase your training volume or decrease it, because on the flip side, if you go from regularly training to not training, you're actually also more susceptible to injury. So this is that kind of sweet spot, the 80 to 130% that you want to stay in to stay injury free and to keep what you're doing, what you're used to doing. So if you have any questions about that, please reach out. We've written multiple training programs for running for people who do 5Ks and 10Ks and even half marathons, and they've had really good success with them. So if that's something you're interested in, just shoot us a message, and have a wonderful Wednesday night.